still necessary. That's what we don't do well in Canada. So this is just a means of putting those constraints on the regulators and forcing them to think a little bit more about the overall picture of the regulatory burden on businesses. Because every department, every regulation on its own, you can argue is important. But nobody thinks about the whole burden and the whole of it and what impact that has on what people are going to do. The fact that almost two-thirds of small business owners...
I have to interrupt you there. I apologize because
Okay.
we're quite a bit past our time. Colleagues, we've been going past time, and everyone, I'm sure if you're watching, please just keep your questions real short. I've been letting it go along because the answers are fascinating. I think are very important, but if we could shorten up our questions... I know. Well, yes. Yes. Not yours, Mr. Backrack. Yours is right on. But if we can just keep it short so we can have more time. Mr. Backrack, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I will try to keep this short. One of my colleagues down the way asked a question about carbon pricing earlier, and I think this is a very topical and interesting question because Canada is signatory to the Paris Agreement, which requires us to do very specific things. And so I'm curious if your organizations, first of all, support upholding our international commitment vis-a-vis Paris. And secondly, if you do support it, which I would hope you would, how you would see the government better approach the question of how we drive down emissions and meet those reductions. There's only a few ways you can get there. You can get there through pricing, you can get there through regulations, and you can get there through incentives. I'm guessing, based on your comments about the ITCs, the tax credits, that you prefer incentives, but all the modeling I've seen is that it's one of the most expensive ways to drive down emissions on a per-ton basis. The United States has invested very heavily in that, but they're also running massive deficits. So what's the right mix when it comes to pricing, regulations, and incentives, in your view, to meet the Paris Accord?
Thank you. Well, Mr. Chair, I'll just jump in. I mean, incentives certainly may be more costly on a per ton basis for a calculation, but the question we're really getting at is where do we want to build the clean economy of the future? Do we want it to be built in the United States or south of the border, or do we want to be doing it in Canada and exporting it to the rest of the world where we can help them also reduce their emissions? So we see incentives as a critical part of that. That doesn't mean that there's not a mix of other tools that can help contribute to it, but we certainly believe there's a chance to enable global emission reductions, but also create good, clean energy jobs for Canadians in this country. The Inflation Reduction Act has sharply changed that conversation for all the reasons that you've outlined. And so it is urgent that the government sort of assess the current environment that we're in, understand how that's impacting investment. But I think germane to this discussion is it's not just incentive, it's not just investment. It's the regulatory environment in which we're asking companies to make these investments to lower burden. It is very expensive, costly, and time-consuming to introduce a new product, service, or modernize a process when you've got so many regulatory hoops to jump through. And so it's also regulating smarter in a way that allows us to enable those clean manufacturing innovations.
Sorry, thanks. Mrs. Cusi, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Unfortunately, a portion of the public service is in the unfortunate position again. We saw a great failure with the public service negotiations maybe 18 months ago, leading to actually strikes and protests outside this very House. We have now again a CBSA strike vote in the next month due to a lack of a contract within the CBSA for 2 years. So I'd like to ask you, Mr. Swants, please, is the strike vote causing uncertainty for importers and exporters?
Yes, it is. And I think the biggest uncertainty is around the timing. The strike may occur at the same time as the CBSA is starting to implement a major new software program called CARM, or the CBSA's Assessment and Revenue Management Software Program. This program has been subject to a number of hearings at the CIIT committee, and there was a motion tabled yesterday at that committee around this. A strike could be quite concerning if it happened at the same time, because we're unsure what the result of that software will be because it's frankly untested.
Thank you. Mr. Greer, would you like to add anything to that, please, on behalf of manufacturers and exporters?
No, just to echo, the timing is of concern to us and our members for the same reasons that Mr. Swan outlined.
Thank you. Ms. Pullman, I see on your website, you are encouraging the government to pass private members bill, Bill C-234, in an effort to provide further carbon tax relief for Canadians. Could you speak a little bit about that, please, about your organization's encouragement of the passing of Bill C-234? Thank you.
Sure. C-234 is the bill that will reduce carbon pricing for certain types of farm activities. And there is already a reduction in carbon pricing for farms in certain capacities, but this is to touch on some of the other elements that the farm uses energy for that weren't a part of the exemption on the carbon pricing in the first place, such as heating barns and other such types of activities. And we have had anecdotal information from some of our ag members that they've seen their carbon pricing go up quite dramatically, having a huge impact on things like how they can operate their business and how they sell their goods. So we are hoping that C-234 in its original form will be able to go through, but we know that there are amendments already being placed on it, which is dampening down what was the original piece. We would love to see the original version pass through the House.
Right, in its original form. Thank you very much for adding that. And finally, Mr. Greco, I'm sure you, as many Canadians, have been following the Arrive scam scandal, the issue which has seized not only this committee, but Parliament and also Canadians. Can you tell us about the discussion about the way that this shows government to conduct business? Is there any discussion, feedback, conversation within your membership as to this scandal, and what would be their reaction and their commentary regarding it if business were to be done in a way that we have seen the Arrive scandal unfold?
Well, I think overall, for business to be done properly, just broadly speaking, it has to be done openly and transparently. And I think when you're looking at procurement processes, there has to be able to be clear guidelines in general. And I think right now, if departments don't talk to each other, if there's not an ability for that transparency to happen, then it makes it difficult to do business. I think every business has a budget. Everybody has to follow guidelines. Everybody has to be able to follow rules. And if you're overspent, it's also a challenge as well, right? So there has to be a balanced approach overall from our perspective. And as long, I think when it comes tying back to regulatory reform, if we're transparent, if we're coordinated and we're aligned, then I think it can lead to better outcomes, not only for businesses, but also for Canadians as well.
In your opinion, does the current Canadian procurement system serve Canadian businesses?
There's procurement reform is required. I think from our perspective, I think if we look at what we tie into even advanced research and commercialization and innovation projects, if we look what has been done in the United States with the U.S. DARPA agency, I think they've been the model in terms of what happens with procurement. I think that ties into the fact that there needs to be fair and open procurement practices, and that's something we've called for at the chamber. I think there's a long way to go. I think that has to tie into be able to encourage more domestic manufacturing, especially when we're competing with our largest trading partners, but also to ensure that we're producing the best goods and services possible for Canadians.
Thank you, witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks very much, Mrs. Cusi. Mr. Sousa, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the four of you for being here. Increasing our competitiveness, reducing the cumulative burden of regulatory issues to ensure that we were able to lower some of the provincial barriers as well as international trade and supplement some of that growth. I mean, regardless of the partisan rhetoric that happens at times in these discussions, we're all in favor of trying to make our businesses more competitive and ensuring that we grow our economy and that we're productive. Those are critical issues. Without that, we can't sustain all the other things that are important to our services and government and to the people of Canada. So there's two issues that I want to get into with you. One is around, in my previous life, I tried to bring forward a capital market securities regulator for all of Canada. We had 8 provinces signed on to the deal, made us more competitive, lowered duplication of services, reduce regulatory matters, and enabled us to be more competitive in the national stage. But politics, right? And so suddenly it falls apart with every different election, and that's a real challenge in the Federation. I think Mr. Bacharach even alluded to that as well. So we have to be mindful that when you're talking to federal government, we're also talking to all the other governments that are part of this equation. So how do you feel about independent regulators. I'm talking about the Ontario Securities Commission, for example. I'm talking about FSRA, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, which we changed from like it was too close to government. We put it arm's length to provide independence and to minimize government interference. Give me your thoughts. Bank of Canada is an example of that.
I mean, I'll jump in very quickly. Some of the independent regulators you referenced aren't necessarily as relevant to our members in the manufacturing sector, but in general, I think you've at the front end identified a really important point, which is it's all the different jurisdictions, and we're talking about dozens of regulators across each jurisdiction, all of whom think they're doing an excellent job and are beyond reproach. And for every individual regulator, even the independent ones, in some cases, I think there can be some usefulness and helpfulness to that. But in other cases, that independence also can sometimes become a barrier to the right kind of political leadership that can help ask for greater consideration of economic impacts.
So if I may step in, I know CFAB will want to talk about this because the majority of the small businesses are affected by some of these issues on other matters, like safety codes, like labor codes. I mean, there are people dying through some of their labor arrangements not far, like 10 years ago. We had to change laws and regulatory authorities because of it. Transportation regulations had to change because of rail derailments. So how do you balance the degree of changes that we're making? This one-to-one thing doesn't work because there are matters that are rarely relevant that have to be dealt with almost immediately, but the cumulative effect is impactful. So which regulations do you want us to reduce? Like, tell me what it is that we can eliminate to be competitive.
Well, I mean, again, I can give you a list of a dozen or more regulations right now that we think are going to have a big burden on small businesses that have been introduced within the last few years. They could be forms, they could be all kinds of different. So I can do that. And I mentioned a few in my opening remarks, right? But I also think it's important to realize that it needs to be more than that. It needs to be, I mean, I look at some of the provinces, right? British Columbia, for example, has done an excellent job of maintaining a cap on their regulations for almost 20 years now. In fact, the NDP government there just announced yesterday they're going to extend it for another year. So they are continuing to do this over a 20-year period and keeping a cap. They put it in their budgets every year. These are all the departments. These are all the regulations. These have gone up. These have gone down. And that kind of thing still needs to be done.
Yeah, and I'll come to you in a sec. So the provincial regulators, the province of Ontario, we've been trying to do that too as well in terms of trying to minimize, but suddenly it keeps growing. Even still, it grows. And so, and one of them is around carbon pricing. So we've identified that we live in a world environment where we're all going to be subject to pricing. The federal pricing system is a backstop. It's not the rule of law. It's the backstop. So each province can do what they want to try to be competitive in the pricing. Ontario had a cap and trade system where dollar for dollar, $1.5 billion was reinvested into businesses, into small businesses, into rentals and deals. So what is your thoughts for the political interference that they wanted to pick a fight with the federal government when they had a system that exempted them from having it? CFIB, tell me, how do you feel about that?
I'm afraid you only have about 12 seconds. Mr. Sousa, is it fair if we just ask him to reply in writing to this?
Oh, no, just say yay. Oh, come on,
Well,
very quickly. Give me some latitude.
Perhaps I can answer. Well, I'm adding latitude to Ms. Atwin's next intervention, so maybe
It'll come up
bring
in
it
the next
there.
round.
Yeah, please. Thanks. We're going to come to our final interventions because we've got a couple extra minutes. We'll do instead of 5, 5, 2.5, 2.5. We'll do 6, 6, 3.5, 3.5. And I've got Mrs. Kusi, please.
I'll pass my time to Mrs. Block, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I will be splitting my time with my colleague, Mr. Genuous. We were speaking about the one-for-one rule earlier in the Red Tape Reduction Act, and I guess I have a couple of questions for any one of you that would like to answer it. In your experience, have you found that the government generally abides by this rule? We'll start with Mr. Greer.
Sure. The short answer is by the letter of the rule and the law, yes. It does require a cost analysis, the standard cost model that Ms. Pullman referenced earlier, and then over a 2-year period you have to reconcile costs in and costs out. So how it's written, yes, but how it's written is too narrow. There are all sorts of legislative changes, guidance, and other rules that the rule doesn't apply to. So you can still abide by the one-for-one rule, which the government is, and still have a significant increase in regulatory burden. And I think I said off the top, the administrative burden baseline, the number of regulations that impose a burden on businesses has increased from 130,000 in 2014 to 149,000 as of 2022. So we're still seeing, despite that rule, a growth in administrative burden requirements.
Thank you very much. I was going to ask, and perhaps you've already answered it, but maybe I'll just see if I've understood you correctly. So do you know of any jurisdictions that have had successful regulatory modernization initiatives, and perhaps what lessons or best practices from those jurisdictions we could adopt? A really quick answer.
Ms. Pullman referenced British Columbia. They actually set out to reduce the overall burdens on business and then maintain it. So I think that would be a worthy goal at the federal level, to reduce and maintain.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn my time over to Mr. Genuous.
Thank you, Chair. I found the testimony very interesting today. Thank you all for being here. I do have a motion that I want to move. It's on notice regarding Indigenous procurement, though, and I hope we'll be able to come to some kind of a consensus on that quickly. So that it is the motion I put on notice regarding the creation of a subcommittee to study the issue of Indigenous procurement. Members had it and are familiar with it and can look at it. For those that were not following us on Monday, just to quickly review, this is a motion that would involve us doing a study through a subcommittee on Indigenous procurement, specifically on government operations and Indigenous reconciliation, looking at some of the issues and potential problems with the Indigenous procurement system. I'd like to make a few comments first on substance and then on process. First of all, Indigenous procurement is extremely important to us, and I hope to all parliamentarians, creating jobs and opportunity, supporting the development of Indigenous businesses, and ensuring that Indigenous communities across this country benefit is something that's very valuable and very important. Through our study of Arrive Can, we've seen that there have clearly been what appear to be abuses. That is, companies that are tiny companies that are not seeking to provide benefit to Indigenous peoples in a broader way are simply receiving contracts and then subcontracting to non-Indigenous businesses. I believe that this is contrary to the purpose of the program, and that getting to the bottom of what happened, recommended changes, is an important way to seek to restore credibility and confidence in the process. This is an issue that is separate and distinct from the Arrive Can issue, although there's obviously a link, and I think it involves looking at both procurement issues and policies of Indigenous affairs. Why am I proposing a subcommittee? I see this as being a policy area kind of at the nexus of what would be INAN's mandate and what would be OGGO's mandate. I know that both committees are very busy. There are other studies that members have wanted to do at this committee, and INAN frequently receives government legislation. Both committees are very busy. I think a subcommittee that brings together people with specific expertise in both of those areas would be the most effective way of doing it. It could be time limited in its operations, but I think it's important. We don't want to crowd out other priorities. We want to make sure there's a forum that can get this done. I do want to work towards having a motion that can succeed on this. Very much open to amendments. I understand Ms. Vignola may have an amendment that I'm very much disposed to. I hope we can have a conversation that leads to us being able to undertake this work in a collaborative way. It's important work. We want to be able to restore confidence in the Indigenous contracting system and ensure that we have a procurement system that is delivering real benefit to Indigenous peoples across Canada and is not being hijacked by well-connected insiders who know how to work the system but are not providing those real benefits. That's why I put forward this motion today, Chair, and I'm very open to some amendments. I expect we'll see some, and we'll have a good discussion about those. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jonas. Does everyone have a copy? It has gone out before. Mrs. Block, you had your hand up. Before I do that, colleagues, I'm thinking maybe we'll, because I'm hoping to get to in camera so we can discuss the translation issue that we sent out, but I'm thinking of releasing the witnesses. I've been getting some feedback from everyone that these have been phenomenal witnesses, and perhaps we'd probably enjoy an opportunity to have them back in. So thank you very much for being with us today. I wish we could have gotten through the last rounds, but I suspect that we will have you back so we can have shorter questions and longer answers. But thank you for joining us. I sincerely appreciate all of you making the effort to be here in person as well. You are dismissed, and we will get to, I think, Mrs. Block. But thanks, and we'll look forward to having you back before summer. Mrs. Block, do we need to? Sure, we're just going to suspend for a couple moments.
Merci. Thank you. Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. We all think it's important to be sure that the policies put in place to provide greater diversity in supply and procurement, all of that is important. I'm speaking for myself, but I think that generally speaking, that would be the feeling of all parties around the table. We all feel that when we give a contract on DEI, we want to attain these objectives, and consequently, we agree in general with Mr. Genuis's motion. It is an important subject. My amendment would allow us to make an analysis or to get into a greater, more detailed study of the documents that I would suggest, but it would be an analysis that would allow us to decide whether or not there is a problem that is generalized, that may well require a broader study in the long run, a more detailed study in the long run. So without beating my drum any further, here's my suggestion. What is lacking in Mr. Genuis's motion is just the basic ideas, but I don't like the formulation. I would say that pursuant to Standing Orders 108(2) and 3C of the Standing Orders, the committee would give a list to the Government of Canada of qualified Indigenous businesses in both official languages, and that would include each business under for Procurement Canada, for PSPC Canada, and also the value that each business represents, and also the specifics of the business. That information would be specified and received by May 2nd, 2024. In view of the fact that we're talking about policies involving Indigenous procurement, and according to the list that would be created here, I think that we could add these elements. That the members of the committee would analyze the said list and would provide a follow-up to have a longitudinal study in committee at the committee's choice. but that be done before June 2024. So step one, you get the list that would allow you to make a preliminary study. And if you come to the conclusion that there is, in fact, a generalized or systemic problem in terms of Indigenous procurement, you then would be able by June 20th to decide whether or not to add that specific subject to the committee's studies list, and that would be, as I say, at the decision of the members of the committee. Thank you.
Sending out Mrs. Vignola's amendment to everyone. Her amendment. Okay. Go ahead, please.
Great.
And then we have Mr. Genos.
I'm really grateful that we've come to this place. I think that the spirit of it, again, we want to get to the bottom of what's happening, and we want to support the policy around Indigenous business and set-asides and procurement strategies. But I was concerned about the broad scope. I really wanted to just take the time right now to comment on how I think problematic it is for a committee to look at and perhaps scrutinize the indigeneity of an individual and perhaps their workforce. There are certain mechanisms within different departments who can conduct these kinds of audits. Indigenous Services Canada is an example of that. I was just concerned again about the broad scope, and so I'm very much open to getting the data, looking at the information first, and then moving from there to determine where we want to take it. Should it require a further longitudinal study? Should it require a subcommittee? I think that we need more information to be able to decide that. And again, because there is a complex issue here around identity, which may become more problematic than we might first assume looking at the initial motion. And so I'm very much in support of Ms. Vignola's amendment.
Thank you. Mr. Genuis on the amendment, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think we're hopefully coming towards a consensus then. I think this is an important area to study, and if it gives members greater confidence in the process, requesting documents as an initial step is very reasonable, and then the committee can evaluate next steps after that. So I'm supportive of the amendment as well. I will just say the original motion and the amendment is about scrutinizing government policy. And that is our job as parliamentarians. It's to look at the government policy as it relates to Indigenous procurement. And I know, of course, that is going to touch on a variety of different important, complex issues. But at the end of the day, it's about looking at government policy and seeing if it's working or not, and making recommendations about how to improve it. So. But I won't belabor the point. I think we're at a consensus, Chair, so I think we can probably proceed to a vote on the amendment and the amended motion.
All right. We're fine with the... Do we need a recorded vote, or are we fine to do so on UC? Perfect. The amendment is adopted. We'll now vote on the amended or the motion as amended. You wish a recorded vote? Perfect. We will do so.
Ms. Atwin.
In favor.
Mr. Baines?
Oui.
Mr. Johari?
Yes.
Mr. Kuzmierczak?
Yes. Well, that's your name.
Mr. Souza?
Yes.
He could barely get out a yes, so I'm not sure he knows.
Ms. Block?
Yes.
Mr. Jennings?
Yes.
Ms. Cousy?
Yes.
Madame Vignola?
Oui.
Mr. Backrack?
Yes.
Yeas pour 10, 10, and nays contre 0.
Excellent. So adopted. Thank you very much, everyone. Yep.
Yeah, Mr. Chair.
Kuzmierczak?
Yeah, just wanted to ask a question. If we can get an update from the clerk on what we had requested in terms of the correspondence between the premiers and the committee regarding their appearance, if we can get that update.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay, thank you. Well, we sent a follow-up to Mr. Higgs' office yesterday about the documentation that was requested originally, I think 2 weeks ago, by the committee. So we will see what fruit the committee will gather from it. And with regard to the question, when the clerk of the committee reached out to premiers for the appearance, as far as I know, the date was March 26. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
I can just ask, have they shared correspondence to that fact with
So
the committee?
far-
Because I think we asked
When you say they, who's they?
the premiers. We had asked them to share correspondence with the committee regarding their appearance.
I think
So-
that's what you were saying is we've
Yes.
requested it again.
Yes, yesterday.
Yeah, again.
Again,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can we bring him to the bar?
Great. We are now going to go into camera because I just need to discuss the translation issue. Everyone's received the letter from the clerk, so we will go into camera. If you're not supposed to be here, please feel free to leave.